Okay, well, thank you so much, Greg, for the introduction, and to the organizers for including me in this seminar series. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this paper here, which is Sherlocking, the effective platform owner entry on the competitive behavior of third-party firms. So let me just get right into it. Platform owner entry, by which I mean instances where the owner and operator of some digital platform creates a product and places that into their marketplace to compete against their third-party complementers, has become pervasive across a wide range of platforms. I think when this idea comes up, or whenever you talk to someone about this, the first thing our minds go to is Amazon, right? I think I'm wearing Amazon branded pants right now. And so presumably at one point in my life, I searched for like blue men's pants, and there was the Amazon listing next to all these third-party listings. And for whatever reason, I chose theirs over the alternatives. But of course, we see this in lots of other platforms as well. When I search Google for coffee shop near me, there are the ratings and reviews from the Google Maps vertical that are sort of sitting above the Yelp and TripAdvisor and other ratings and reviews for coffee shops farther down in the organic results. And then I think one example that has always been sort of amusing to me and very interesting to me is illustrated here, which is that DoorDash, the food delivery service, has toyed around with running its own ghost kitchens, which would be in direct competition with third-party or independent restaurants that it's sort of ostensibly there to serve. And so I think, pick a digital marketplace you engage with, you're almost certainly going to see instances of platform owner entry there. And just as this practice has become increasingly widespread, so too has criticism of this practice. It has been very controversial. There's lots of debate worldwide about whether or not we should be permitting this and to what degree we should be permitting this, whether or not this is fair, and so on. And I think what we've seen is the policy debate has been very wide-ranging. Some calls and some actual regulation that is very targeted and precise, other calls and attempts at regulation that are much more blanket or sort of overwhelming. And I think that extreme case is best illustrated by this quote from Elizabeth Warren, who ran in the Democratic primary for US president a few years back, where she said, you can be an umpire or you can be a player, but you can't be both at the same time. And then as her quote goes on, she actually says it's past time to break them up. And so her view and the view of many in this space has been, if Amazon wants to sell pants, it can sell pants, but it can't run Amazon.com and run a pants operation at the same time. And so, I think one thing that has been particularly notable about the policy debate in this space is that it has vastly outpaced the empirical literature on this topic. And while there's a lot of good work going on in this space, and I'll refer to it in a little bit, I think there's still a lot we don't know, and this paper is an attempt to sort of fill those gaps by essentially asking, when a platform owner enters, what happens? How do firms strategically respond, if at all? And hopefully that can help inform these debates. The empirical context I'm going to be thinking about today is going to be Apple and its App Store. It turns out that Apple has been engaged in this kind of conduct for basically its entire history. There's this wonderful interview with Steve Jobs from the mid-90s where he says, quote, "We have always been shameless about stealing great ideas." And I think that really exemplifies Apple's approach in this space, which is they're often looking to their developers, their third-party complementers, seeing what's succeeding with them and what they're doing, and then integrating those ideas into its own software offerings. And so this has been a practice that has gone on for a long time. Developers are extremely aware of this sort of concern about platform owner entry here. And in fact, they're so aware of it, they've nicknamed it. They call it Sherlocking, which is where the term in the title comes from. And this is a reference to this app you can see on the left here called Watson. This was an independent app on the Mac operating system for many years, which would let you sort of search your computer for files, look up, as you can see here, movie listings. You could access the Yahoo web portal, which was sort of the way to do things at the time. And Apple saw the success of this, and as the story goes, there's a little bit of dispute here, but as the story, according to most developers, goes, they copied this feature for feature and integrated it into their app called Sherlock, and thus Sherlocking was born. And so I'll use that to refer to this notion of platform owner entry going forward. This, as I said, is something developers think about constantly and talk about constantly. Every year when Apple announces its changes to its operating system, they joke about filling out their Sherlocking bingo card with all the great apps and products out there that they think are about to be destroyed by Apple. Here's a tweet from a developer, saluting his fellow developers who are about to be Sherlocked. And so this is, I think, a not just sort of an academic concern, but rather a broad, real concern that exists in this industry, and I think applies to the other platforms I mentioned previously as well. What's notable about Apple's case, or the software case, I should say, is that Apple can sort of enter in one of two ways. The first way is sort of what we'd see on Amazon's platform or others, which is what I'm going to call standalone entry. And this is instances where Apple is going to Sherlock some apps. It's going to copy or produce some functionality that developers were producing. It's going to build or bundle those into an app and place that onto the store shelf. And so this is like a very traditional form of entry. The alternative is what I'll call integrated entry, which is that Apple can Sherlock apps, it can create competing functionality, but rather than placing itself on the shelf to compete alongside all those third-party developers, it can just integrate that functionality into its operating system. And this, I think, is unique in the sense that in this way, its competing functionality, its version of these products is sort of unavoidable from the consumer perspective. And so we can, I think this is a distinction that is sort of interesting to keep in mind. I'll come back to this a little bit later today. Before I get to any of the data or analysis that I'm going to engage in, I want to think a little bit about the economic forces that are at play here. I'm not going to sort of write down a whole model for you, but I want to sort of highlight a few key ideas that are going to be relevant for developers when Apple enters and they think about how to strategically respond to that entry. So let's imagine that we are some third-party developer. Apple has Sherlocked us, which is to say it has entered into our market to compete against us with its own version, either in a standalone or an integrated fashion. And we want to think about, what are our concerns or what things might we anticipate occurring as a result of this entry. The first order effect is that now I have to compete with Apple. Apple is an enormous company. It is a well-resourced company. It has lots of software talent, development talent. This can be daunting for developers who are often small firms or even single individuals that are running a firm. And so I'm going to put a little minus sign to the start of this bullet point here, just to sort of to say, like, this is a significant and negative effect on these developers. Of course, from a policy perspective, we might not worry about this. This is competition. We tend to welcome that. We might worry a little bit about the big versus small of it all, but that's something that is probably not a major policy concern here. What is more likely to be concerning to regulators or policymakers is the fact that Apple owns and operates the storefront, and so it can self-preference. It can advantage itself in the marketplace relative to these third-party firms. And in fact, this has been alleged against Apple and many other platforms. The screenshot you see on your right here is from a Wall Street Journal article a few years ago, where they basically ran a bunch of searches on the App Store and argued that Apple was giving itself preferential placement in search results relative to independent third-party apps. So you would search for podcasting app, and that purple icon on the screen there would appear towards the top of the list, even though Overcast or Pocket Cast or these other apps that were very popular and well rated may have been the better product for the consumer, they're going to fall farther down the search results, at least according to this Wall Street Journal investigation. So that's, I think, one reason why developers are wary of this sort of platform owner entry, the Sherlocking. And there, I think there's more clearly a room for policy concern and regulation because of the sort of discriminatory conduct the platform is engaged in. Very closely related to that and specific to the software context is the fact that Apple not only runs the store, but they run the hardware and software stack of technologies that developers are operating on top of. And so, yes, they could self-preference themselves in the store. That's sort of an Amazon type story as well. But what's unique here is they can give, or they can restrict, or they can provide access to individual features of the operating system, individual features of the hardware devices, and so on. And in fact, Spotify has been very vocal about this for many years, arguing that Apple gave Apple Music preferential access to the Siri voice assistant and the HomePod smart speakers, which it did not get access to for many years, and that sort of market, as they put it. So when Apple enters, when Apple Sherlocks the market, these three things are going to occur with sort of varying weights, perhaps. and all look quite negative from a developer's standpoint. And so if we're thinking about, what is the effect of platform owner entry going to be on developers in the App Store, this makes it look like it will be a largely negative result. But what's interesting is if you talk to developers, and indeed when I've spoken with developers, they're often quick to point out positives they associate with this entry as well. The first point I often hear is that when Apple enters a submarket of the App Store, when it Sherlocks some category of apps, it often integrates new APIs and hardware into its operating system and its devices that can benefit these developers. And so to translate this from sort of the tech speak to more of an economics language, right, the idea is, sure, like all these negative things in these first three bullet points may be playing out, but my production function is suddenly more advanced or more efficient or more capable than it was before. And that can be a big advantage, right? There may be new sensors in the iPhones that I can leverage to conduct my whatever my product is doing better than it was before. There may be dedicated chips for machine learning algorithms or something like that, and that can advantage my product as well. So, one example of this is in this tweet I've screenshotted for you on the right here, where we see this developer talking about being Sherlocked by Apple back in 2022. So this was the developer of a product called Camo Studio. This was a pandemic era innovation that basically said, we're all on Zoom all day. Our laptop cameras are pretty bad. Our phone cameras are highly advanced. Wouldn't it be great if we could use our phone cameras when we're running Zoom on our laptop? And so Camo Studio did exactly this. It gave you that ability to link the devices, use your very nice camera when you're on Zoom all day. And it was quite popular at the time, and I think continues to be used by many people. In 2022, Apple Sherlocked this category. It integrated this functionality into its operating system. Everyone right now watching this call on a Mac could be using their phone's camera through built-in operating system level features. And so what did the developer say when he got Sherlocked? He said, well, first, thanks for the support. More flexible APIs, so hooks into the operating system, an ecosystem of mounts for keeping phones on top of laptops, and Apple's support won't hurt. And we're going to go deeper than you might imagine. We'll have great capabilities and so on. And so here's, I think, an exemplary case of a developer sort of saying, like, yes, bad things may happen. Thank you for the support, but I can now integrate phones into laptops with fewer bugs, or I can do more advanced functionality that you may value that I couldn't have done before. And so that in that way, this entry may be associated with positive benefits for developers, not just sort of negative cost as in those first three bullet points. In the interest of being like candid and honest with you all, I should say in late January, early February of this year, Camo Studio sued Apple over exactly this scenario. So their views on the matter seem to have shifted over the years, but nonetheless, I think this is sort of a nice example of what developers often will point out when discussing Sherlocking. The other thing developers are quick to point out is that when Apple enters a market, the demand often increases substantially for products in that category. And the idea here is pretty simple. If Apple tells its millions and millions of users, you need to be better at managing your passwords, well, what do we think is happening to the aggregate demand curve for password management apps? And so again, yes, a lot of bad stuff may be happening when Apple enters, and I don't like that as a developer, but there are just so many more people looking for products in my category that I may actually end up more profitable than before. So these are sort of the forces that are at play here. Whenever Apple enters, some sort of like weighted average of these 5 points are going to play out. And the question for me today is going to be sort of net of these concerns. How are developers responding when Apple enters? Are they fleeing the platform? Are they innovating more or less often? Are they restructuring their business models and their monetization schemes? That's going to be sort of the focus for me today. I'm not going to cut to the slide about this in the interest of time, but I'll say there's been a lot of really great work in the last few years that in particular sort of picks one of these bullet points and does a very critical and deep dive on that particular mechanism. The self-preferencing one, I think, has gotten the most attention for perhaps obvious reasons. But I think what we're lacking is sort of the bird's eye view of what plays out here. There have been a few papers that have looked at this in limited context, but I think the contribution here is largely to just look at a number of cases of Apple entering and try and think about what are the commonalities in developers' responses across these cases, as well as what are the differences market by market. So that'll be sort of the value, I hope, of this project here. Okay. So the approach I'm going to take here is to estimate a difference in differences model. comparing Sherlock apps, so apps that are affected by Apple's entry on the App Store, to comparable apps on the Google Play Store. So I'll describe how I do this in a moment, but I'll identify apps on the Google Play Store that would have sort of been in market, if you will, had they been on the App Store when Apple entered. And that'll be my comparison group. Just to preview the results for you a little bit here, what I'll show you today is that when Apple enters a market, entry by new apps falls substantially. It falls by about 23% on average. I will argue to you later on today that that number probably understates the welfare impacts of this decline in entry. I'll show that there's no effect on the exit margin. Pardon me. Developers don't appear to exit at a higher or slower rate than before, although there's some nuances there we'll get into. On the incumbent margin, thinking about incumbents on the App Store, apps that were there before Apple entered, I'll show you that they appear to respond strategically by adjusting their monetization models. They're going to raise prices, not so much that apps that were charging a non-zero price push prices higher, but rather that many apps that were free to download are going to switch to being paid to download, which suggests or I should say, indicates a pretty substantial shift in their monetization scheme. And then finally, I'll provide evidence that the quality of incumbents rises after Apple's entry. There's some evidence here, I think, that is consistent with this idea that incumbent developers, are sort of shifting to the higher end of the market to better serve customers there. And so that'll be associated with higher frequencies of updates, higher average ratings. And while I don't see sales or revenue, unfortunately, I'll have proxies for consumer demand and engagement, and I'll show you that those are moving upward, at least on average. The final thing I want to say about the results that are to come is that everything I've described to you thus far are average effects. But it turns out that when you break things down market by market or spatially within the platform, there's just a tremendous amount of heterogeneity. And so I think really the story here today is that the answer to how do developers respond to Apple's entry is it depends. I'll try to speak a little bit to what it depends on towards the end of today's talk. But as we think about regulation in this space, this really suggests that these sort of blanket bans or platform level policies may be misguided, that we need to be thinking about these things on a sort of market by market basis. So you'll see a lot of documentation of that heterogeneity as we go along here. Okay. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take those here. Otherwise, I'll talk a little bit about the data. Great. Oh, okay. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the data I'm going to use, and then how I deal with one sort of significant challenge in analyzing this data, and then we'll move to the analysis. So the data set I'm going to use here comes from a company called AppMonsta. This company has changed names more times than I can count, so you've probably seen it used in other papers if you've read work in this area, but under varying names. This is going to allow me to construct a monthly panel data set that consists originally of all of the apps in the App Store and all of the apps in the Google Play Store from the beginning of 2015 to roughly the middle of 2022. A lot of apps on these stores are just junk. They are hobby projects. You and I could get an app on the App Store over the weekend if we wanted to. They are products that were once competitive and now have been abandoned by their developers. It turns out it's very cheap to keep something on the store shelf, if you will, in this case, in this context. And so often, rather than formally exiting, developers just sort of leave the product up, and occasionally it pays for a coffee or something like that. And so I'm going to place some restrictions on who's sort of in the analysis sample and who's not, based on their performance, using a bunch of sales ranking and revenue ranking lists. This is a pretty low bar for inclusion in the sample, I should say, and results don't appear to be too sensitive to sort of playing around with these parameters. But that's going to be sort of how I'm going to choose what to look at here. I'm going to consider 23 instances of Sherlocking of Apple entering into the App Store. 14 of these will be standalone apps that sort of consumers can delete from their devices. 9 of them will be integrated directly into the operating system and thus in some sense unavoidable from the consumer's perspective. For each of these 23 entrants, I'm going to look at a period of 9 months before and 9 months after the entry event, Apple entering into the marketplace. So that'll be sort of the window I'm looking at for each of these. One significant challenge in analyzing these markets is that markets are not well defined within this ecosystem. So there are millions of apps in the platform here. and there are not sort of clearly defined, precise markets that already exist sort of ex ante in these marketplaces. There are categories. If you pull up the App Store on your phone now, you can search it for photography and games and things like that. In some cases, there are subcategories, but the platform itself does not have really nicely sort of tightly defined markets. And in fact, if you look at the productivity category, that's going to include apps for managing your passwords and apps for managing shift workers on oil fields. And these two sets of developers are sort of unquestionably not engaged in competition with each other. And so if we want to think about Apple entering into a market, I sort of want to know who are the developers that are potentially affected by this. I don't want to sort of look at what is the sort of broad category-wide effect of that, because that could be significantly misleading. So the approach I'm going to take here is to take advantage of the fact that I have text descriptions of all of the apps on the App Store. These are the same descriptions you and I would read on our phones as we're buying a new app. Think of this like advertising copy. I can use a word embeddings model, so these transformer models that sort of are the foundation of all these AI agents we're using these days, to basically map that unstructured text to a high-dimensional vector space. I'm providing you with a two-dimensional representation of that high-dimensional space on the right here. And then within that space, I can sort of identify where all of Apple's products are, here with the red and blue boxes for the standalone and the integrated cases. And then I'll be more precise about this in the next slide, but I'll basically like draw a little circle around them and say sort of if you're close enough to Apple's product, you're in market, and if you're farther out, then you're not. And so that's going to be the approach for defining markets here around each of these individual entry events that Apple has engaged in. The way I'm going to define that proximity or define those markets more precisely is to use a measure called cosine similarity. This is commonly used in the natural language processing literature. And the idea here is basically, every app here is a vector. I've illustrated 4 of them for you on the right here. Apple's translation app is that solid red line. We have a couple other translation apps in blue, and then you can see a calculator app up there in gray. And what you do is you basically take these vector representations from these embedding models, and you take the cosine of the angle between two vectors, and that gives you a measure of similarity between two apps. And so I'm going to set some threshold, I'll call it theta, on this cosine similarity measure. And basically, if your similarity is theta or better, you're in market, and if it's not, then you're out of market. And so you can see the cosine similarity between Google Translate and iTranslate is quite strong compared to Apple. That is, the angle itself is small, whereas the calculator app has a much wider angle and is therefore a lower level of cosine similarity and will be defined as out of market. In practice, I'm going to set theta equal to 0.6. You can vary that number around. This isn't in the paper, but it's some work I've done recently. You can vary that number around, and it turns out it doesn't matter much in terms of all of the results I'm going to present to you going forward here. What's nice about this approach is it allows the markets to very flexibly vary in sort of natural ways. So the graphs I've shown you here are 3 of the entry events, 3 of the Sherlocking events I'm going to look at in the analysis. As we move from right to left, we are broadening that definition. We're lowering theta, the requisite amount of similarity to be in market. And the vertical axis is giving you the number of apps that would fall in market. And you can see that as we sort of broaden the market definition, shifting right to left, more and more apps are entering each market, but at different rates. And so what's nice, I think, about this approach is I'm not sort of restricting this to be the 200 most similar apps or something like that to Apple. Rather, the ECG market can be relatively small. The translation market can be relatively large. And so we keep that sort of natural fact about the data here. Okay, so that's going to be the approach to defining markets here. Once that's in place, we can then engage in estimating these differences models to better understand how developers are responding to Apple's entry. To think about that, I'm going to sort of think of things along 2 margins. The first is sort of extensive margin behavior. I want to think about what's happening to entry and exit on the platform. Then I'll shift to what I'll characterize as an intensive margin, which is among incumbents who are already on the platform prior to Apple Sherlocking that category. How are they strategically responding to the entry? So I'll start on the extensive margin and then shift towards that intensive margin. Okay, so the models here are going to be very standard differences models. You can see the extensive margin model here. For thinking about the rate of entry and exit, what I'm going to do is think about for each market, so for each Sherlocking event and each platform, how many apps entered and exited each month. That'll be my outcome variable. I'll take the log of that. So for example, in the translation market on Apple, how many entrants did we see this month versus next month versus the following month and so on. I'll do the same counts over on the Google platform, and then that's the comparison we're engaged in here. I'm going to estimate and present results from a two-way fixed effects model today. This is a staggered diff and diff, right? Apple is entering these markets at different points in time. It is, I think, well established at this point from lots of recent econometric work that a staggered diffing diff can have problems. I'm going to stick with two-way fixed, or I should say the two-way fixed effects model in this context can have problems. The results I'm going to present to you will come from the two-way fixed effects model. In, I think, the first appendix of the paper, certainly an appendix of the paper, I'll re-estimate a lot of these things with the Callaway and Santana, or sorry, the Sun and Abraham and the Wooldridge extended two-way fixed effects approaches. The results are going to be very similar. The two-way fixed effects model is going to be sort of more computationally tractable for me and allow for some of the extensions we'll see later. But I'm happy to chat about that later on if there remain concerns there. But just so we're sort of clear about what estimates we're seeing, that'll be the approach. So let's estimate that model and see what happens. What happens when Apple enters into a submarket, when it Sherlocks a submarket. As I previewed for you earlier, entry falls by a substantial amount. There's a 23% reduction on average in entry. This is, I think, notable in two ways. First, that's a very large percentage in my view. The second thing is that probably understates the welfare impact of this. The reason for that is the following. I think in these software markets, we tend to think about entry as a fairly noisy process in the sense that developers are often not well informed about their quality prior to making the decision to enter. They may have some signals and indication of how good their product is, but they don't really have a strong sense in many cases about their sort of product market fit. And in instances like that, what we really want to do from a welfare standpoint is just have lots of draws, right? We want to see lots and lots of entry, see what sticks and see what doesn't. And so when in these noisy environments, we see a big reduction in entry, you're not just losing sort of the low quality entrants, the sort of marginal entrants who decide not to enter. Rather, some of the entrants you're losing were going to go on to be the next big thing. And so that can be quite costly. And so I think this is a significant finding and a significantly negative finding from a welfare perspective. That said, I'll give you some nuance on that in just a moment. Let me say, as I previewed earlier too, there's no evidence of an effect on exit. Firms don't seem to exit the platform at a higher or lower rate. Although, as I mentioned earlier, it's very easy to keep a product on the store even if you've sort of abandoned it in some sense. And so this lack of an exit effect could be that developers are still fully engaged on the platform, or it could be that they have moved on to other things, but they left their stuff on the store shelf. So that's, I think, one caveat I want to provide. I'll look at updating behavior of incumbents in just a moment, which I think will give us a better sense of how developer effort is responding to Apple's entry. All of that said, what I've described to you are averages. If we break this down market by market, we can see there's tremendous heterogeneity across markets. So yes, entry is down 23% on average, but in some markets, it's down by substantially more. In others, it's roughly that amount. In others, it's a very small decline. And indeed, in some, we see evidence of increases in entry following Apple's Sherlocking of the market. So in the schoolwork market, the sort of second to last one, right, they're entering a market for sort of managing iPads and the like in a classroom setting. Think of like an elementary school. That seems to have spurred education apps to enter into this market. And so the cross-market variation, I think, is really the big story here. Indeed, I told you a moment ago there was sort of no evidence of an effect on exit, but that was an average again. And it turns out in many markets, we see a decline in exit, and many markets, we see an increase in exit. Now, my earlier caveat that we don't want to lean too heavily on this particular exit outcome, because many apps just sort of remain abandoned on the store shelf, I think stays and is valid here. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to see this variation play out across markets here. The other thing we can think about is not just the quantity of entry and exit and how the frequency of entry and exit is changing, but also how the composition of entrants is changing after Apple Sherlocks the market. So the idea here is, some apps entering before a market gets Sherlocked may price in a certain way, may be of a certain quality, may design their products in a certain way. And of course, Apple's entry into the market could shift those strategic decisions by those entering developers. And so what I'm going to do now is cut my data back to looking at every entrant in my sample period. in their first month of life. So think of this as sort of like a repeated cross-section of entering cohorts that I'm looking at. And I'm going to estimate this model here, which is basically saying after Apple enters, how do various pricing and quality outcomes change compared to before Apple entered? And still we have the Google Play Store in the control group here. So what happens when Apple enters? New entrants onto the platform after a market has been Sherlocked tend to price higher, largely because fewer of them are free to download. So it's not that sort of prices conditional on a non-zero price are going up. Rather, some apps that prior to Sherlocking would have been free to download are now charging a price to download for download. And so I think that's a pretty noticeable shift in monetization here. The entering apps after a market has been Sherlocked are also higher quality on average. The star ratings are going up by 0.16 stars. This is a real but small effect. So this is 0.16 stars on an average of like 4.2 stars among this population, somewhere in that range. So average rating is up, quality is up according to this measure, not by a major amount though. So I don't want to sort of oversell that. The other thing I think that's worth noting here that we can look at is what happens to the similarity of these apps to Apple's product. So remember, the way I've defined markets is to calculate the cosine similarity between this sort of like text vectorization of each app for Apple and these independent apps. And so what we can ask is, well, if we look at entrants prior to Sherlocking and entrants after Sherlocking, do they sort of converge on Apple's location in the product space, or do they flee Apple's location in the product space and sort of diverge in that manner? On average, the effect is roughly zero here. We don't see evidence of an effect there. But of course, the story here is heterogeneity. And so, what's actually playing out here is in some markets, we see developers diverging from Apple's position in the market. We see other cases where Apple is converging on, where Apple apps, are converging on Apple's position in the market. And we see a number of cases sort of in the middle of this figure where the effect is roughly zero. And I think this is an area that I'd really like to highlight because I think there's a lot more work to be done here. Certainly, it's something I'm continuing to think about, but I'd love to see others think about this as well, which is this idea that Apple is sort of trying to cultivate this broad ecosystem in service of its hardware that's selling to customers. And one way it can sort of push people around, developers around in that space, may be to enter into some of these submarkets, to Sherlock some of these submarkets, which can then either attract developer interest in some cases, like we see in some of the health categories at the bottom here, for example, which could sort of bulk up sort of a region of the ecosystem that Apple that Apple may think is underdeveloped, or it can sort of send developers fleeing to other categories and spend their effort elsewhere if Apple may think that something is sort of overly congested or something to that extent. So I think there's a lot more to be done here, but I think it's sort of interesting to see that entrants in some markets are sort of strategically repositioning themselves after Apple has entered and Sherlocked this market. Okay, so that's what's happening on the extensive margin. Let me now tell you a little bit about intensive margin behavior, thinking about incumbents. I'm going to define an incumbent in a fairly strict way here. These are going to be apps that were on the App Store at least 9 months prior to Apple's Sherlocking of that market and persisted at least 9 months after. So I think, on one hand, we might wonder about what's happening to apps that are exiting at some point here. But what's nice about this approach is everything I'm about to show you will be driven by strategic responses of these incumbents, not by shifts in composition or something like that. Again, I'm going to run a very standard two-way fixed effects model with a diff and diff. Again, see the appendix of the paper to see this on an Abraham and the Wooldred approaches to estimating this, which will account for the fact that we have this staggered treatment playing out here. Let me not spend time here. Let me just jump right here to the results. So let's think first about monetization, and then we'll think about quality responses of these incumbent developers. So Apple Sherlocks your market. What do you do in terms of your monetization strategy? Well, similar to what we saw in the extensive margin, it looks like prices rise. That price increase is, again, not driven by prices that were above zero going even higher, at least on average. Instead, it seems to be primarily driven by apps that were free to download, shifting to a pay-to-download monetization model. This is, again, I've said this a few times now, but this is a pretty noticeable shift in this case because consumers are very reticent to pay for apps at all. There's existing evidence that suggests that sort of the the disutility of going from sort of 0 to 99 cents is substantial relative to 99 cents to much higher prices. And so I think this is a significant shift in strategy from these developers. You can see the dynamics of this shift from free to paid playing out in the figure on the right. So I'm showing you those alternative estimators. The blue circle lines are the two-way fixed effects model I'm focused on today. What you can see is sort of we move along to the red line, which is right before Apple enters. There's a little bit of anticipation there a month or two out. That's not too surprising because Apple often pre-announces its entry, so developers sort of have a sense of what's coming here. Then immediately after Apple enters, we see this huge decline in the proportion of apps that are free. That appears to be a little bit of experimentation as developers are figuring out like what the hell is going on here. And then it jumps back up. It remains at this depressed level. So in the sort of long run there, at least through this 9-month period I'm looking at, the number of free apps is lower than before across these markets, although not as extreme as it may initially look. The other thing I find evidence of on the monetization front is that developers are less likely to rely on in-app purchases. These are these microtransactions you can engage in within the apps. So we can think of these as subscriptions, add-ons, extra features, tokens for games, and things of that nature. So they seem to be shifting away from that as well. Now, one thing I can't tell you is whether developers are shifting away from that type of monetization, the in-app purchases, or if they're just moving that stuff off platform. I think it's worth noting that if every dollar that's transacted on the platform, Apple is taking either 30 or 15% of the dollar. And so developers have a strong incentive to sort of run this stuff through their website or off of the platform. That can be challenging because of various sort of non-steering rules Apple has had for a long time, which have sort of come under fire in the EU and in courts in the US. But one possibility is that developers are just shifting monetization off platform. Another possibility is that they're substituting in-app purchases for advertising. I don't have insight into that in this sample, so I can't speak to that directly. So I'm not sort of suggesting they're not charging money or earning money within the product, but it's certainly less so through the in-app purchases. Taken together, though, these monetization changes suggest, again, that developers are sort of serving or trying to serve the higher end of the market. So Apple will often enter with a high-quality product that has relatively limited functionality. And so often the way these developers can survive, and they'll say this themselves, is by offering sort of more advanced functionality. Apple has entered with something that provides new functionality within the camera or the Photos app. I can't compete with that directly, but I can offer way more advanced camera functionality. And there's a small subset of the population who may really value that and be willing to pay for it. So there's a possibility that that's sort of the story that's playing out here. As with all the stuff I showed you earlier, these effects vary market by market. You see markets where these things go up, where they go down, where they stay relatively flat. Rather than showing you those figures again, let me show you a different form of heterogeneity, which is that these responses also vary spatially within the market. So again, recall I can measure the similarity between Apple's product and every third-party app. That allows me to basically place everyone on like a hoteling line, which I've illustrated for you here, where Apple is going to enter on the far right of the figure. Technically, Apple would be at a value of 1, which is sort of off figure. There's sort of nobody there, so I'm going to just show you where the third-party apps are. But Apple's going to enter at the far right of these figures. As you move right to left, we are getting farther away from Apple in terms of this cosine similarity measure. So you can think of apps that are farther to the left as sort of more differentiated. And we can re-estimate this two-way fixed effects model, but now integrating a spline to sort of flexibly capture the fact that the treatment effect may vary as we get farther away from Apple. And sure enough, that's what we see in a number of cases. So where are prices going up? Well, it's not for the developers on the far right who are most directly affected and most directly copied by Apple. It's largely among those apps farther towards the periphery of the market. Where do we see the switch from free to paid? Kind of everywhere, maybe a little bit more for those apps that are most directly impacted by Apple. Obviously, there's less precision on the far right there because the data's thinner there. But if you sort of buy the line, then we see an even greater switch from free to paid for those that are most directly affected. And then finally, where do we see the reduction in in-app purchases? A similar story playing out here. Everywhere, across the board, we sort of see this decline in the use of in-app purchases, but it seems to be strongest among those developers going most sort of directly head-to-head with Apple. We can also think about what happens to the quality of incumbents. I can look at the frequency of product updating from these developers, their star ratings, a measure of their quality, as well as the number of ratings and reviews they get each month. You should think of that latter one as a proxy for consumer demand and engagement. I don't see sales data directly, but if we think that the number of ratings and reviews that come in are some function of underlying demand, that function is unlikely to be affected by Apple's entry. And so it should give us sort of at least directionally a sense of where demand is shifting, even if we can't sort of take the numbers to the bank necessarily. What happens here? Updating frequency increases. That suggests that developers are more engaged on the platform than before. They may be attempting to sort of quickly, strategically respond and reposition in response to Apple's entry. Average ratings are going up. This is a statistically significant effect. It is a very small effect. So this is 0.02 stars relative to an average within this population in the upper 3 stars. And then finally, there's evidence of this market expansion effect that developers sort of predicted or anticipated, which is this idea that more consumers are coming to the market. And you can see that illustrated in the right figure there. Again, there's the heterogeneity across markets. There's heterogeneity across markets there, as well as spatially. The last thing I want to say here, just in the last few seconds, is I've shown you a lot of evidence of heterogeneity in response to Apple's entry, both across markets and spatially as well. It's a natural thing to ask, well, why is there that heterogeneity, or what explains it? One thing that seems to play a really big role in this is whether Apple has entered in a standalone or an integrated fashion. The effects are substantially larger, for the price and free outcomes here in these integrated cases rather than the standalone, which again suggests that when Apple enters in a way that consumers sort of can't avoid, they can't delete the app or ignore it or choose not to download it, that seems to have a very different competitive effect than when Apple places a new thing on the store shelf and consumers can sort of use it or not. Similarly, the demand increase seems to accrue to apps that are affected by integrated entry more so than standalone entry. Of course, there's variation within these categories. I think that's consistent with this idea that developers are sort of pushing to the high end of the market, because essentially Apple's going to enter with baseline functionality that's integrated in many cases. That's good enough for most customers. So who's going to see sort of an opportunity to raise prices or higher demand? It's those that are serving the sort of high end of the market, where consumers value more advanced functionality and are willing to pay for. There's some more ongoing work I'm engaged in now to think of other determinants of this. That seems to be the primary thing that's driving everything. So let me just wrap up here. What happens when Apple enters a market? Entry falls substantially. Incumbents raise prices, switching free to paid. It looks like quality goes up and demand goes up. But again, the punchline here is that there's just a dramatic amount of heterogeneity in my view. There are positive effects, there are negative effects, there are lots of null effects, which I think are notable in their own right. And so what I would say is, as we think about regulating this behavior, it's really important to keep in mind, and I think these results sort of support this idea, that digital platforms are not monoliths. And so we should think of them as collections of markets and regulate on a sort of per market level or a sort of per theory of harm level, which in some sense is a very traditional notion, but I think is one that has often gotten lost in the public debate on this issue. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Ben, for keeping good time. Let's go straight into the discussion. Daniel, please.
All right. Let me set a timer. Okay, great. So thanks so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here. I'm not going to waste time summarizing it because I think Ben did a really good job. So let me just, and I don't have slides because I was asked not to have slides. So let me just jump in. So let me first talk a little bit about what I think is really nice about the paper, right? So I think one is it's an important question. So this competition between downstream firms and platform owners is, fundamental to many online markets right now, and is a fundamental kind of question about competition and antitrust. And so getting more evidence on that is obviously important. I also like the breadth of this project, right? So it has like wide, take on platform entry. It uses a lot of data from both the Apple Store and Google. And in general, I think the data work is really impressive, right? So they do, Ben does a lot of really great stuff on the embeddings to market measurement and all this sort of other stuff. So overall, it's a really cool project. It's really great. I just have a few points. So Let me try to focus my points on the stuff. So there's obviously like a lot of richness to the paper, and there's a lot more in the paper than what Ben presented. So again, I encourage you to actually read the paper. Let me try to focus my points on the stuff that was presented. So the first one is this distinction that Ben mentioned at the end and also the beginning between Apple entering a new app and Apple integrating a new feature into the OS, which I think are like fundamentally different objects or like fundamentally different kind of actions. So one basically affects competitors through like search, right? And basically like standard competition. The other one like is potentially like bundled with all sorts of like OS changes that, changes the defaults, like what apps appear when you search for something. It potentially changes, the data access to different pieces of your phone. It still matters for search. It potentially changes like all sorts of other aspects to do with like the costs of running an app or entering an app. And in many ways, I think it's a very different story than there just being a new Apple product on the iOS store. And so it's a problem both in the sense of conceptually, I think they should really be separated, and then also in terms of identification, I think it's worth thinking about like whether it confounds any other changes with the OS with these entry effects. And then the other thing, again, I couldn't help but think more that the paper needs just a little bit more kind of conceptual framework, and a bit more kind of understanding. Like again, like when I was reading these results, like I just want to understand, is this efficient or is this inefficient, and kind of what are the welfare implications for the market as a whole, not necessarily just for the developers, right? So, in some ways, Apple entering these new apps is efficient, not just because of market expansion and all this other stuff, but also because, existing apps are crappy. Apple enters something that's much better, that's, has better security. It has real benefit. And so again, like the paper has a bunch of stuff that talks a little bit about welfare, that leads us to think about welfare a little bit, like the price effects, the quality effects. But I also wanted to think a little bit more about the relationship between the Apple app that enters or the product that enters relative to the products that are available or the products that enter, right? Like, so again, like there's a little bit on like how many features they add and stuff like that, but thinking about where it lands relative to Apple is really useful. And again, there's a little bit about that in terms of the embeddings, but I really want to think about more, something that gives us a bit more of a sense of like, okay, well, like they're actually differentiating in terms of these features. They're actually expanding the market in these different ways. And, just a little bit more discussion on kind of the overall competitive mechanisms. Again, like prices can be related to quality. You have higher quality, so you have a higher price, or it can be about, you're kind of locking in your residual demand and exploiting that. And so it's potentially kind of inefficient. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of really awesome stuff in this paper. And I really look forward to seeing where it goes next. And so I'll leave the rest to the discussion. Thanks.